The budget process should include both program staff as well as the fiscal staff. This way you can build your budget that has a clear understanding of your program's bigger financial picture, as well as the AmeriCorps program goals and objectives. It's also a good idea to keep the budget as simple as possible. You'll want to keep in mind the monthly reimbursement process and all of the necessary documentation that you're going to have to submit to support these costs. So if you have a lot of line items, that can make the reimbursement process a bit more cumbersome. Your previous budgets as well as spending will be included in this budget template. Go ahead and take a look at your previous year or two for any patterns or unused lines. Remember that you should not have to request multiple budget modifications. You want to thoughtfully construct the budget based on historical information as well as your future expectations. So we have some expectations in order to make the budget process go smoothly and quickly. First, we expect that you can fully allocate and expend the grant award. For example, if you have an award of $100,000, the full amount of that $100,000 should be allocated. We also expect that you can meet the 50% match requirement, and we also expect you to show calculations for all your expenses. Now, as you allocate expenses for AmeriCorps, you also want to allocate expenses for match. Match should make up 50% of your total budget. So for example, if you have a budget of $100,000, match would also be $100,000. It's a 1-for-1 match requirement. So match are the goods and services necessary to accomplish the goals of this grant. Anything that's allowable as expense is also allowable as match. Your match needs to be verifiable. It needs to be booked in your general ledger as a debit and credit, and it cannot be included as a contribution to another federally assisted program. And it needs to be necessary and reasonable to accomplish the goals of this grant. Okay, so let's take a look at the budget template and start building a budget. The first tip before you start entering in your amounts is to use whole dollar amounts. You don't want to use any cents, C-E-N-T-S, since this could cause some rounding issues. In the first part of your budget template, you'll see personnel expenses. This is likely the largest part of your budget. First, you'll want to include the staff names, their position title, and a brief description as to what this person is doing and how they're assisting in the overall objectives. You'll want to include their annual salary. Now this is their full annual salary. And next to that, you'll put the percentage of time that is actually being spent on this AmeriCorps grant. Now that percentage of time is going to be multiplied with their annual salary to get the total amount. So this total amount is split between the corporation share, which is the federal share, and the subgrantee share, or your match. Now a tip is to put most of your budget under staff, because you already have this documentation, so that's less files that you have to maintain. So you want to keep a budget as consolidated as possible. So for example, if you are 100% AmeriCorps, utilize full personnel salary. So if you have a construction trainer that's 100% DOL, and you have 100% AmeriCorps members, then put that person's full salary in the budget. So next, we move on to fringe benefits, and there are two methods you can do your fringe benefits. If your organization has a single rate and it's less than 30%, you can show that rate in the calculations. But make sure that this is a rate that your organization consistently uses. So when you go to submit your monthly reimbursement requests, we should see this rate. So even if your rate is less than 30%, but it isn't a consistent rate that your organization is using, then you still need to break that out line by line. So if your organization doesn't have a consistent fringe rate, or if that rate is above 30%, that's when you need to break it out line by line. So you want to identify the fringe benefit under purpose, and then provide a detailed calculation for that fringe benefit. Now, if you have any actual costs that you're including in your fringe benefits, you'll want to include that actual amount and then show us how you're allocating that to the grant. Now, an important thing to keep in mind when you do fringe, and this is probably the number one reason that we have to send back budgets for revisions, you do not want the percentage of your total fringe under the corporation share to be greater than the percentage of salaries you are billing under the corporation share. So in other words, fringe should be prorated based on how salaries are being split. So fringe might be the trickiest part of the budget. So if you have any questions or you're having any issues, feel free to reach out to your fiscal contact at YouthBuild USA and we can walk you through it before you actually submit a budget. So now that we've taken care of staff, we can move on to the various other subsections of your budget. So next up we have staff travel. So if you're joining us at the AmeriCorps Management Conference, you can budget for those expenses. It's important to keep in mind that your hotel is already paid for. So you'll want to budget for your airfare, ground transportation, and meals. But keep in mind that we do provide breakfast and lunch, so you should not budget for those meals. You'll just want to budget for your dinners. So you can visit gsa.gov to find the maximum federal rate that we can reimburse. You may also attend the NDA, so any staff under AmeriCorps that are attending that conference, you can budget for that as well. Some other examples are travel from the program site to the service site, or travel to any professional workshops. And you can base these calculations off of your internal travel policies. So next up we have member travel. If you're sending any of your AmeriCorps members to COIL, this is where you can put a small travel allowance. Now meals are provided at the conference, so you're only going to budget for meals while they're traveling. And make sure not to base this off of your per diem policies. These are not employees. So they should be maintaining receipts for any purchases they make while traveling. And be sure not to include their COIL registration in this section. That would actually go into the member training section later in the budget. Some other examples of member travel would be travel from the program site to the service site. A lot of our programs are using member vans, and you'll want to show your calculations for your van expenses. So expenses for gas, insurance, maintenance, and make sure that you are allocating these expenses based on the number of AmeriCorps members actually using the vans. A few other examples, member bus passes, Metro cards, this would all go under member travel. So next up we have supplies. Most likely you're going to budget for your member service gear. This is your gear that has an AmeriCorps logo. Now there's no maximum that you can spend on gear since the CNCS is all about branding. They want to make sure that our AmeriCorps members are always wearing that AmeriCorps logo. So you want to make sure that you can display this somehow. Many sites purchase t-shirts, hats, stickers, buttons, patches, any way to make sure that that logo is always visible. You can also budget for your safety gear under supplies. There's no limit for safety gear. This would be things such as your safety glasses, hard hats, boots, and gloves. If you anticipate having any day of service expenses, you can budget for that under supplies. We also recommend budgeting for AmeriCorps signage, especially for our news sites. You'll want to make sure that you are displaying that logo somewhere on your site. When portfolio managers come out to do their site visits, one of the first things they're going to look for is whether or not you're proudly displaying that AmeriCorps logo. And also, if you're budgeting for any single item that's more than $1,000, that should appear on its own line. And once again, as with everything in your budget, you want to make sure that you're showing your calculations, even for your supplies. So tell us the number of units you're purchasing, as well as the cost. If you leave anything blank, it's just going to give us an opportunity to send you an email and ask for another revision. After supplies, you'll see contractual and consultant services. A lot of programs contract out for construction, education, accounting. So just be sure to include those calculations and make sure these calculate across correctly, we also want to see the daily rate. Your staff training section is going to be anything related to professional development. Now, you want to make sure this doesn't include any cost associated with travel. Those would go in the staff travel section. This section is basically for registration fees. If you're using a consultant for staff training, you can include that consultant's daily rates and show those calculations. Next, in the member training section, you're going to see a line for CPR/first aid. Since this is required for all members, we keep this line in the budget. If you're doing your CPR in kind, then you'll want to capture that in kind as a source of match, and this will help you reach that 50% match requirement. This is also where you would put your COIL registration. Make sure that no travel associated with COIL is in this member training section. That will go in the member travel section. Now let's move on to the other program operating costs section. One of the required lines is background checks. These are required for both members and for staff. For staff, if they have already appeared on a previous budget and they've had continual employment, then they are already covered. Now you can also budget for your office space, rent, and utilities under other program operating costs. But it's important to make sure that these are not already included as your indirect costs. So if they are considered as part of your indirect cost pool and you're also billing them directly, then you would be double dipping for these costs. And if you're operating under multiple funders, we want to make sure that you're allocating these expenses. Now, you should have a cost allocation plan that details how you allocate expenses. It might be based on program size, number of members, square footage. So if you have multiple funders, we don't want to see you billing 100% of your office space or utilities to AmeriCorps. We want to make sure that we are reimbursing the fair share. So if you are allocating, please be sure to show those calculations. Also in this section, you can budget for your member recognition costs. This includes things such as trophies and certificates. Just make sure you're not budgeting for anything that's expressly unallowable. So we can't reimburse gifts, gift cards, food, or any sort of entertainment. Next, we have the member living allowance section. If you have full-time members, they need to receive a living allowance through this grant as either expense and/or match. Now, this is a living allowance and not a stipend. It shouldn't have anything to do with an hourly rate. They should be receiving a consistent biweekly or bi-monthly rate. So when you go to determine your members' biweekly rate, you want to keep in mind that they have a year to complete their service. So if you budget for 10 months and they go beyond that 10 months, then you will likely overspend on that line item since you can't change their rate. Under member support costs, you can budget for your members' health insurance. You must offer health insurance to your full-time members, and this health insurance needs to be in accordance with AmeriCorps regulations. If your AmeriCorps members already have health insurance, then they can waive that. You could not, however, pay for health insurance for your half-time members using corporation funds. If you want to offer those benefits, you'll have to find some non-federal source. Although if your half-time members are serving in a full-time capacity, let's say they're serving in a full-time service project, then they would be eligible for those healthcare benefits. But keep in mind that the corporation cannot reimburse dependent coverage. We also have a line for FICA. If you happen to be FICA exempt, please include that documentation along with your budget. You'll also need some sort of liability insurance. You'll want to check with your state's requirements. If your state doesn't require workers' comp, then you can have another form of liability insurance, and that would go up into the other program operating costs section. Now, towards the bottom of the budget, you'll get to the admin cost section. Now, on the corporation side, it's a fixed rate, 5.26%, and we put this in your budget for you. So you don't want to touch this. You can't charge any more than this, and you can't charge any less. Now moving over to the match side for admin costs, there's two options. First, if you have a federally approved indirect cost rate, you must use it. So the way you use this is you take your rate and you subtract out the corporation fixed rate. So for example, if you have a federally approved rate of 22%, you'll subtract out that 5.26%. 16.74% will be your indirect rate under match. And if you do have a federally approved indirect cost rate, you'll also need to submit that documentation along with your budget. Now, if you do not have that federally approved indirect cost rate, then you must use method 2, where you can bill up to 10% of all direct cost expenditures. So that means 10% of your total budget under program and member costs. Now we've calculated that for you. So if you're using that 10%, take that number and plug it into match for your indirect costs. At the bottom of your budget template, you're going to see the sources of match sections. First, you'll see a section for in-kind, and below that, you'll see a section for cash sources. Now, in-kind is anything such as CPR training that may be in-kind from the Red Cross. A lot of programs overlook a lot of good in-kind opportunities for match. So you'll want to take advantage of these funds in order to reach that 50% match requirement. And under in-kind, you'll see a section for your cash sources. For any source of match you are putting into your budget, make sure you also identify the purpose of that match. This way we can see where in the budget the match is being used. YouthBuild does have some approved federal funders where we have written authorization to use as match. This would include the U.S. Department of Labor, Department of Education, Administration on Aging, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture. But do keep in mind that AmeriCorps itself cannot be used as match for another federal funder. Now, there are some federal funders that should not be used as match. These include OJJDP, DLL Smart, and Face Forward. And if you have federal pass-through funding, such as a WIA grant, it is possible to use this if you have written approval from your program officer, and we'll want to see this documentation before we can approve the source of match. So if you have any questions at all, big or small, as you are building your budget, please reach out to your AmeriCorps fiscal contact. It's always best to address questions and get clarification prior to actually submitting your budget. The AmeriCorps team, they're here as a resource to help make this grant startup process go as quickly and as smoothly as possible.